Chapter 1. The Shattered Reflection. The scream that tore through Blackwood Manor at 6:30 on a fog-choked October morning was not the polite, restrained sort one expects from an English country house. It was raw, animal, the sound of someone who has seen the impossible made flesh. Mrs. Marjorie Fleet, the housekeeper of 31 years, stood frozen at the attic door, one liver-spotted hand clamped over her mouth. Her starched apron trembled as violently as the candle she had dropped. Wax pooled across the dusty floorboards like pale blood. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck the half-hour with its usual solemn authority. But up here in the West Wing attic, no one was listening. The only light came from a single dormer window filmed with decades of grime, and from the open door behind Mrs. Fleet. In that sickly glow stood the antique mirror. It was a monstrous thing, 7 feet tall, Venetian glass framed in blackened gilt, shipped to England in 1789 by the 3rd Baronet, Sir Reginald Blackwood, after a particularly profitable grand tour. The silvering had long since begun to flake, giving every reflection a diseased mottled quality, as though the glass itself were rotting. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been shrouded in Holland cloth and exiled to the attic. No one liked the way it watched. This morning, the cloth lay in a crumpled heap. The mirror stood naked and terrible, and across its ancient surface someone had scrawled a single word in still wet blood. Murderer beneath it, slumped against the claw-foot legs of the frame, was the body of Alistair Blackwood, master of the house, only surviving son of the late Sir Hugh, and, for the past 11 months, owner of everything the eye could see from the manor's highest chimneys. Alistair's throat had been cut so deeply that his head lolled at an angle no living neck could achieve. His silk dressing gown, midnight blue with silver dragons, was soaked black from collar to hem. One arm was flung outward as if in greeting. The other lay across his lap, the palm sliced open. A cut-glass tumbler lay shattered nearby, whiskey and blood mingling in a sticky pool that reflected the single dreadful word above. Mrs. Fleet found her voice at last. It came out a cracked whisper. "Mr. Alistair, oh dear God!" She staggered backward into the narrow corridor and collided with young Elsie the housemaid, who had come running at the scream. "Fetch Mr. Denham," the housekeeper gasped. "Fetch the master's valet. No, fetch everyone. Ring the police. Oh, merciful heavens!" Elsie needed no second bidding. She fled, apron strings flying, her shriek echoing down the back stairs like a second, younger ghost. 20 minutes later, the attic swarmed with shocked, half-dressed people wrapped in dressing gowns and suspicion. Reginald Denham, Alistair's valet for 15 years, stood rigid at the threshold, his military moustache quivering. Behind him hovered Miss Lavinia Blackwood, Alistair's niece, and, until this morning, presumptive heiress, pale as parchment, one hand pressed to her lips. Dr. Miles Harrington, the family physician who had been staying overnight after treating old Lady Diana's rheumatism, pushed past them both, knelt briefly by the body, and rose again with a grim shake of the head. "Dead several hours," he announced. "Between midnight and 3, I should say. Poor devil never stood a chance." Inspector Reginald Moss of the County Constabulary arrived before 8, driven up the gravel in a rattling Austin with 2 damp sergeants. He was a large, slow-moving man with the patient eyes of a bloodhound, and he took one look at the mirror and swore softly under his breath. "Who found him?" he demanded. Mrs. Fleet, fortified with brandy in the housekeeper's room, repeated her story between hiccuping sobs. She had risen early to air the west wing. Lady Diana had complained of mustiness, and decided to check the attic linen cupboards. She had noticed the attic door ajar, which was unusual. She had climbed the last flight. And the cloth was off the mirror, she finished, voice trembling. I've always told them that mirror was bad luck. Sir Reginald, the 3rd Baronet, hanged himself in front of it in 1823, and now this. Inspector Moss grunted. We'll have the fingerprint powder up here directly. Nobody touch anything. His gaze swept the room and settled on the message. Written in the victim's own blood, unless I'm much mistaken. That's personal. Lavinia Blackwood stepped forward. She was 26, tall, with the kind of dark beauty that made people speak of tragic heroines, though her grey eyes were anything but tragic this morning. Sharp, watchful, almost calculating. Uncle Alistair was alive at 11:30, she said clearly. I passed him in the library. He was pouring himself a whisky and muttering about sorting everything once and for all. Those were his exact words. Was anyone with him? Moss asked. No, the house was going to bed. My aunt retired at 10 with one of her headaches. Dr. Harrington gave her a sedative. The staff were below stairs. I read for an hour and then went to my room. And you, miss? Did you hear anything in the night? Lavinia hesitated. The smallest fraction. Only the wind. The storm was fierce. It had indeed been fierce. Blackwood Manor stood on a rise above the River Rye, and last night the wind had come howling off the moor like a living thing, rattling windows and sending draughts snaking under doors. Perfect cover for a murderer's footsteps. Inspector Moss turned to the valet. Denham, you laid out Mr. Blackwood's clothes last night. Yes, sir. Dressing gown and slippers by the fire. He said he wouldn't need me again. And the attic key? Denham's face tightened. There are only 2. One on the master's ring, one on Mrs. Fleet's. The attic has been locked since Miss Lavinia was a child. Moss looked at the door. The lock was old but intact, no sign of forcing. He stared at the ring of keys still clipped to Alistair Blackwood's belt, now crusted with gore. One of them, presumably, opened this door. Up close, the blood message on the mirror looked even more grotesque. The letters were uneven, frantic, the R reversed like a child's scrawl. Droplets had run downward in long crimson tears. Written by the victim himself, Moss mused aloud, or by the killer to taunt us. Dr. Harrington gave a humourless laugh. If Alistair wrote it, he managed the feat after his throat was cut and with his right hand half severed. Observe the angle. Left-handed work, I'd say. A silence fell, thick as the dust motes drifting in the shaft of grey light. Lavinia broke it. There's something else, Inspector. She pointed to the lower left corner of the mirror, where the ancient glass met the frame. A single clear fingerprint, perfect, unsmudged, stood out in blood against the dark wood. Someone touched the frame after the murder, she said quietly, and they weren't wearing gloves. Inspector Moss followed her gaze and felt the small hairs rise on the back of his neck. In that print, in the smeared accusation above, in the impossible locked room and the cursed mirror itself, he sensed the shape of something cleverer and more malignant than any crime he had met in 20 years on the force. Far away in London, in a flat overlooking Regent's Park, Hercule Poirot replaced the telephone receiver with his usual precision and permitted himself the smallest of smiles. His old friend, Chief Inspector Japp, had been almost apologetic. It's probably nothing you'd be interested in, Poirot. Just a sordid family killing in Devon, but the local man says the scene is good, and there's a mirror involved. Thought it might amuse you." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Amuse me? Mon cher Japp, you know my weakness. A mirror that reflects not only the face, but the soul of the murderer. Yes, that will amuse me very much indeed." He reached for his hat, his Malacca cane, and the small leather case that contained 3 perfectly laundered white pocket handkerchiefs. Outside, the fog was lifting. By evening he would be at Blackwood Manor. And somewhere in that house of whispers and secrets, a reflection waited, stained with blood, that would soon reveal the truth to the little Belgian with the magnificent moustaches. But for now, in the cold attic, the mirror stood silent, the single crimson fingerprint drying slowly, and the dead man at its feet kept his last secret a little longer. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Past. The rain came in sideways that afternoon, rattling the leaded windows of Blackwood Manor like thrown gravel. In the great hall, a fire had been lit, but the warmth barely reached the corners where shadows pooled thick as spilled ink. The house itself seemed to be listening. Inspector Moss had cleared the attic for his men and ordered the family and staff to remain downstairs. They gathered now in the long drawing-room that smelled of beeswax, damp wool, and old grief. No one spoke above a murmur. The grandfather clock ticked with the solemnity of a judge. Lavinia Blackwood stood by the tall windows, watching water stream down the panes. She had changed into a charcoal-grey dress that made her look older than her 26 years. Dr. Harrington sat near the fire, nursing a brandy he had not tasted. Lady Diana Blackwood, Alistair's elder sister, confined to a bath chair these past 5 years, occupied the centre of the room like a deposed monarch, her arthritic hands knotted on a black lace handkerchief. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fleet, hovered with a tray of untouched tea. Reginald Denham, the valet, stood at rigid attention by the door, as though still expecting his master to walk in and demand fresh cuffs. Inspector Moss entered with wet shoulders and a notebook already swollen with rain. He shut the door firmly, cutting off the draught. "Right," he said, "before the Devon constabulary tramples every clue into the floorboards, I want the history of this house, all of it, especially that damned mirror." Lady Diana gave a thin, humourless smile. "You'll need a longer afternoon than this one, Inspector." "Begin with the mirror, madam." She lifted her chin. "Very well. It came into the family in 1789. My however many greats-grandfather, Sir Reginald Blackwood, bought it in Venice from a bankrupt Conte who claimed it once belonged to a doge's mistress. The lady supposedly poisoned 3 husbands and then cut her own throat before it. Sir Reginald laughed at the story, paid in gold, and had the thing crated home. Lavinia turned from the window. "He hanged himself in front of it 34 years later, Aunt, after the estates were mortgaged to the hilt, and his only son died of fever in India." "Coincidence," Lady Diana snapped, but her fingers worried the lace. Mrs. Fleet set the tray down with a clatter. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but the staff have always known it for an unlucky piece. Maids refuse to dust it. When Master Alistair was a boy, he swore he saw a woman in black standing behind his reflection, though no one was there. He ordered it covered and locked away the very next day." Dr. Harrington cleared his throat. "Country superstition, though I will admit the glass has peculiar properties. The silver backing is tainted with mercury. Over centuries it creates those dark spots. Amalgam disease, the trade calls it. Gives reflections a corpse-like quality." Inspector Moss scribbled. "And last night, who was in the habit of wandering the house after midnight?" A brittle silence. Lady Diana spoke first, My brother suffered from insomnia. He often roamed. The library decanter was usually half empty by morning." Lavinia added, softly, "He had grown worse these past months, ever since the new will was drawn up." Every head turned toward her. Moss's pencil paused. "New will?" Lady Diana's eyes flashed. "Idle gossip, Inspector. My brother was considering certain adjustments. Nothing signed." "Nothing signed," Lavinia echoed. "Yet everything changed. Uncle threatened to leave Blackwood Manor to the National Trust, rather than see it frittered away on Parisian dressmakers and roulette wheels. His words, not mine." Lady Diana's knuckles whitened. "You ungrateful chit! Enough!" Moss barked. "Miss Blackwood, were you the sole beneficiary under the previous will?" Lavinia met his gaze steadily. "I was, but there were others with expectations. My aunt's medical bills are ruinous. Dr. Harrington has been kindness itself in extending credit." Harrington flushed dark red. "Really, Miss Blackwood?" "And Cousin Roderick in Tangier has been wiring for funds twice a year since I can remember. Uncle refused the last request in July, quite savagely." Moss made another note. "This Cousin Roderick, is he in England?" "No one has seen him in 6 years," Lady Diana said acidly. "He is persona non grata here." The inspector closed his notebook. "I'll need addresses, bank records, and a full list of last night's occupants. Now, the attic key on Mr. Blackwood's ring. Who else possessed a duplicate?" Mrs. Fleet wrung her hands. "Only the one on my bunch, sir, and I swear on my mother's grave it never left the hook by my bedroom door." "Yet the attic was unlocked this morning," Moss said grimly. A soft knock interrupted them. Sergeant Lees put his head in. "Begging your pardon, sir. The fingerprint on the frame, it's clear enough for comparison, and there's something else." He held up a small evidence envelope. Inside lay a single gold cufflink, heavy, old-fashioned, engraved with the Blackwood crest. A raven clutching a broken arrow. "Found it wedged behind the mirror's baseboard," Lees said. "Still had a spot of blood on the edge." Lady Diana stared at the cufflink as though it were a scorpion. "Those were my father's," she whispered. "Alistair inherited the set. He was wearing them last night. I noticed at dinner. He never took them off, not even to sleep." Moss felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when a case suddenly reveals deeper waters. "So," he said quietly, "either the victim carried a spare cufflink to his death, or someone who had access to his dressing room was in that attic after the murder." Rain lashed the windows harder. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed, though there was no wind inside. Lavinia walked to the fireplace and stood with her back to the room, shoulders rigid. "There is one more thing you should know, Inspector," she said, barely audible above the storm. 3 weeks ago, Uncle received a letter postmarked Cairo. The handwriting was Roderick's. I saw it on the blotter the day it arrived. Uncle read it, turned white as chalk, and burned it in the library grate. That night he fetched the attic key from Mrs. Fleet's bunch while she was at evening service. I heard him on the stairs. He was muttering to himself, something about settling the past before it devours us all. She turned then, and for the first time the mask slipped. Fear, real, animal fear, flickered in her grey eyes. The next morning he ordered the mirror left exactly as it was. No cleaning, no covering. He said, "Let it stay naked. Some truths are better seen plainly." Dr. Harrington set his untouched brandy down with a click. "Good God," he said, "you think your cousin Roderick has come back?" "I think," Lavinia answered, "that something has come back. Whether it wears Roderick's face or not remains to be seen." High above them, in the locked and guarded attic, the great mirror stood patient as a spider. The blood had dried to a rusty brown. yet the single accusing word still glared. Murderer! And beneath the flaking silver, in the diseased heart of the glass, shadows seemed to shift, though no living person moved in the room. Outside, the storm gathered its strength for a long, wet night, and the oldest whispers of Blackwood Manor began to speak again. Chapter 3. Poirot's Arrival. The Bentley growled up the drive at 20 minutes past 4, tires hissing on wet gravel. The rain had eased to a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the world the colour of wet slate. Blackwood Manor loomed ahead like a wounded beast, its chimneys smoking defiantly against the low sky. Hercule Poirot stepped out with the neatness of a man who dislikes being damp. He wore a long ulster of exquisite cut, a grey Homburg, and an expression of polite curiosity. His moustaches, magnificent even in adversity, were protected by the brim of the hat. Behind him, the chauffeur wrestled with 2 pigskin suitcases and a small dispatch case that Poirot never allowed out of his sight. Inspector Moss met him on the front steps, cap in hand, looking as though he had slept in his uniform, which he almost had. "Monsieur Poirot, sir, I can't tell you what a relief it is to see you." Poirot inclined his head. "You flatter me, Inspector." Chief Inspector Japp merely said the local police were, how did he put it, out of their depth in a puddle. I came at once. Moss gave a weary grin. "The puddle is getting deeper by the hour." He led the way into the hall, where the fire still fought a losing battle against the cold. The household had been summoned. They stood or sat in a loose half-circle, like suspects in a badly rehearsed play. Poirot's gaze travelled over them with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Lady Diana in her bath chair, regal and venomous. Lavinia Blackwood, pale but composed, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. Dr. Miles Harrington, younger than Poirot had expected, early 40s perhaps, with the strained politeness of a man who has been drinking coffee since dawn. Reginald Denham, the valet, standing behind his late master's empty chair, as if Alistair might still walk in and demand his newspaper. Mrs. Fleet hovered at the edge, eyes red-rimmed. Poirot removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. "Bon, I perceive that tragedy has visited this house. Permit me, before we ascend to the chamber of death, to understand the living." He began with the smallest of rituals. He walked the hall slowly, cane-tapping, eyes everywhere. He paused at the suit of armour by the staircase, touched the tarnished breastplate, noted the faint film of dust on the pauldrons, but none on the visor. Recently opened, then. He examined the grandfather clock, opened the glass face, and sniffed delicately at the pendulum. "Beeswax and gun oil," he murmured. "Curious combination." Moss raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Poirot turned to the assembled company. "Madame," he addressed Lady Diana with a bow that managed to be both courtly and ironic, "you will forgive the impertinence of a stranger, but you are the sister of the deceased." "I am." Her voice could have frozen brandy. "And you, mademoiselle," to Lavinia, "the niece, and, until recently, the heiress?" Lavinia met his gaze steadily. "Until recently, yes." "Dr. Harrington, you were a guest in the house last night." "And gave Lady Diana a sedative at 10 o'clock, Harrington replied, a shade too quickly. "I myself retired shortly after." Poirot's eyes flicked to the doctor's hands. Well kept, but the right thumbnail was bitten to the quick. Nervous habit, or something more? "And you, Monsieur le Valet?" Denham drew himself up. "I laid out Mr. Alistair's dressing gown at 11 and saw him no more until this morning." Poirot nodded, then addressed them all. "Before I examine the attic, I require one thing only, that each of you, in your own fashion, tells me what you believe happened last night. Not what you know, not what you fear, what you believe. We begin with the heart, always." An uncomfortable stir. Lady Diana spoke first, acidly. "My brother was murdered by someone who hated him enough to write an accusation in his own blood. That is what I believe." Dr. Harrington, "A quarrel that got out of hand. Alistair could be provocative when he drank." Lavinia, very quietly, "I believe the past came back for him." Denham said nothing at all, only stared at the Persian rug as though it might open and swallow him. Mrs. Fleet began to cry again. Poirot absorbed it all like a sponge, then clapped his hands once, softly. "Excellent! Now we ascend." The attic stairs creaked under their combined weight. Sergeant Lees stood guard at the top, looking relieved to see the inspector. The door to the west attic stood open. The smell of blood and cold iron hung in the air. Poirot entered alone. For a long moment he simply stood, taking in the scene with the stillness of a painter before a canvas. The shrouded furniture like huddled ghosts. The single dormer window, weeping rain. The mirror. The mirror. He approached it slowly, almost reverently. The blood had darkened to a dull brown crust. The single word murderer seemed to pulse, though that was surely imagination. Poirot tilted his head, studying the glass. The diseased silver threw back a dozen fractured Poirots, each one subtly wrong, as though the mirror disliked him on sight. He took a small pocket torch from his coat and shone it along the frame. The bloody fingerprint was already circled in white powder. He examined it without touching, then moved the beam lower. "Tiens," he whispered. At the base of the mirror, almost hidden beneath the ornamental scrollwork, a narrow panel had been slid aside, no more than a finger's breadth. The gap was invisible, unless one knew to look. Poirot's gloved fingertip traced the edge. The panel moved easily, as though recently oiled. Inside lay a shallow recess containing a folded square of yellowed paper and something else. A tiny glass vial. Empty, its cork stopper missing. Poirot did not touch them yet. He straightened and turned to Inspector Moss, who waited in the doorway. "Your men, they searched the frame. We looked for compartments, sir. Nothing showed on the plans, and the wood sounded solid." "Yet here is a priest's hole for secrets," Poirot said softly. "And secrets, mon ami, are what this house breathes." He stepped back and surveyed the body's position, removed now to the stables, but chalk marks showed where Alistair had fallen. Poirot crouched, measured with his eye, then stood again. "The cut is from left to right, upward slant. The killer stood here." He positioned himself behind the chalk outline. The victim was already on his knees, perhaps bending forward. See how the arterial spray arcs across the lower glass, but not the upper. He was looking into the mirror when the blade came. Moss swallowed, looking at his killer's reflection. "Or at his own face as he died," Poirot said. "There is a difference." He moved to the shattered tumbler, knelt again, and sniffed. Whiskey and something else. Almonds? No, too sharp. Prussic acid, perhaps. He looked up. We must ask the doctor. Finally, he stood before the mirror itself and addressed it almost conversationally. "You have seen many things, n'est-ce pas? Betrayals, despair, perhaps even this death. You will tell me everything in time." Behind him, Moss shivered, though the attic was not cold. Poirot turned briskly. "Now, Inspector, you will have the contents of the hidden compartment photographed exactly as they lie, then brought to me in the library. You will also obtain for me the household keys, all of them, the dinner menu for the past week, and the exact time each person claims to have retired last night, written in their own hand. And finally, a pot of chocolate. The English tea is dishwater. Moss blinked. Chocolate, sir. Poirot permitted himself a small smile. The little grey cells function best when the stomach is content. As they descended the narrow stairs, Poirot paused on the landing and looked back toward the attic. The mirror was no longer visible, yet he felt its gaze on his back like a hand between the shoulder blades. "Someone in this house," he murmured, "has looked into that glass and seen more than their own reflection. Someone has seen a ghost, or a demon, or perhaps the truth about themselves. And they have killed to keep the vision silent." He tapped his cane once against the banister, a decisive little sound, but they reckon without Hercule Poirot. Down in the hall, the fire crackled and spat. The household waited, each nursing private terrors. None of them yet understood that the most dangerous presence in Blackwood Manor had just walked through the door wearing patent leather shoes and an expression of perfect urbanity. The game, as Poirot liked to say, had begun. Chapter 4. Shadows in the hallway dinner that evening was a travesty. The long mahogany table had been set for 8 out of habit, then hastily reduced to 6 places, when no one could bear the sight of Alistair Blackwood's empty chair at the head. Silver candelabra flickered. Rain lashed the French windows. The portraits of long-dead Blackwoods glared down as though personally offended by the living. Poirot sat at Lady Diana's right, impeccable in evening dress, a white camellia in his buttonhole. He ate with delicate precision, sole Veronique, roast pheasant, a creme caramel that Mrs. Fleet had produced through sheer nervous energy, while observing everyone with the bright, unblinking attention of a cat at a mouse-hole. Conversation limped along in monosyllables until Lavinia, seated opposite Poirot, set down her wine-glass with a small, deliberate click. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you have examined the mirror. Tell us plainly, do you believe my uncle was murdered by someone in this room?" A collective intake of breath. Even the footman froze with the sauce-boat. Poirot dabbed his moustache with a napkin the colour of fresh snow. "Mademoiselle, at this moment I believe only one thing with certainty, that the truth is hiding behind many veils, and each of you is clutching at least one of them." Dr. Harrington gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "That's hardly an answer. It is the only honest one I possess tonight." Lady Diana's rings flashed as she gripped the arms of her bath chair. "My brother was slashed like a calf in an abattoir. I want more than Belgian riddles." Poirot inclined his head. "Then permit me a small experiment after dinner. A reconstruction, if you will. Nothing dramatic. Merely a few questions in the West Wing corridor at midnight. The hour, you understand, is important." No one liked it, but no one dared refuse. At 11:45, the house settled into uneasy quiet. Servants had been dismissed to their own quarters. Only the principals remained. The storm had returned with redoubled fury. Thunder rolling across the moor like artillery. Poirot gathered them in the first-floor gallery. A long, dark passage lined with ancestral portraits and a threadbare Aubusson runner. A single lamp burned at each end. Between lay 30 yards of shifting shadow. He held a large keyring taken from Mrs. Fleet's bunch and jingled it softly. "Last night," he began, "Mr. Blackwood left the library at approximately 11:35, carrying a fresh decanter of whisky. Miss Lavinia passed him here." He indicated a spot beneath the gloomy gaze of Sir Reginald III, Baronet, the one who hanged himself. She was going to her room. The west wing stairs are at the far end. The attic door lies beyond. He turned to Lavinia. Mademoiselle, will you walk the corridor exactly as you did last night? Slowly, please. Stop where you last saw your uncle. Lavinia drew a breath, then obeyed. Her heels clicked softly. The lamplight caught the pale oval of her face and the darkness of her dress. She halted halfway, beneath a portrait of a woman in black. He was standing here, she said. He had the decanter in one hand, a glass in the other. He looked strange, almost as though he were listening to someone I could not see. Poirot nodded. And you heard nothing? No second set of footsteps? Nothing but the storm. Thank you. Now, Dr. Harrington, you retired at 10:15. Your room is the second on the left. Did you take a sedative yourself? Harrington flushed. A mild one, yes. Veronal. I slept heavily. Yet you are a light sleeper by profession. A door closing, a raised voice, these things wake you not. Usually. Last night I heard nothing. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Curious. He moved to the attic door. Heavy oak, iron hinges, the lock old but sturdy. He inserted Mrs. Fleet's key. It turned with a soft complaint. Observe, he said, the lock is well oiled. Someone has used it recently and often. Yet Mrs. Fleet swears the key never left her room. Denham the valet shifted his weight. The master had his own key, sir. Indeed, and that key was found on his body this morning, covered in blood. Therefore the murderer either used the second key, Mrs. Fleet's, or was admitted by Mr. Blackwood himself. He opened the door. Cold air breathed down the narrow staircase like the exhalation of a tomb. Poirot produced his pocket torch and started upward. The others followed reluctantly, a silent, reluctant procession. At the top he paused. Last night the attic door stood ajar. Mrs. Fleet noticed it at 6:30. Between 11:35, when Miss Lavinia last saw her uncle alive, and 6:30 this morning, someone came up these stairs, killed Mr. Blackwood, wrote upon the mirror in his blood, touched the frame with a bare finger, and departed, locking the door behind them, or not locking it, if they used the victim's key and took it away again. Thunder crashed directly overhead. The single bulb flickered wildly. Poirot swung the beam across the floorboards. Fresh chalk marks outlined the body and the spilled whiskey. The mirror stood shrouded now in a police sheet, yet its bulk was more disturbing covered than bare. Attend, Poirot said softly. He stepped to the exact spot where Alistair had died. The killer stood thus. He raised an imaginary knife. The blade enters from the left, upward. The victim is already low, kneeling or bending. Why? He knelt himself, shining the torch across the floor at ankle height. Ah, voilà. The beam caught a thin tripwire stretched taut between two iron staples, hammered into the floorboards no more than 3 inches apart. It had been painted the same dusty brown, and was almost invisible unless one searched for it. Harrington gave a startled exclamation. Good God! Exactly, Poirot said, rising. Someone prepared this room in advance. The victim enters, perhaps in darkness, perhaps carrying a candle that gutters in the draught. His foot catches the wire. He stumbles forward, arms out to save himself, and in that moment the knife strikes. The tumbler falls and shatters. It explains the angle of the wound, the absence of defense injuries on the hands. A trap, mes amis. Premeditated, cold-blooded, and very nearly perfect. Lady Diana's voice floated up from the stairs. She had remained below, but her hearing was sharp. Then my brother was lured here. Or came of his own accord, Poirot corrected. That is the question. He crossed to the shrouded mirror, and with a magician's flourish, whipped the sheet away. The glass stared back at them, diseased and terrible. The dried blood word had been photographed and removed by the police. yet faint shadows remained like bruises. Poirot addressed the mirror directly. "You were meant to be the final witness, were you not? The last thing he saw." He reached into the hidden compartment and drew out the yellowed paper he had found earlier. In the torchlight, he unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. The ink faded to sepia, dated 1919. "My dearest Alistair, if you are reading this, I am already dead or fled beyond your reach. What we did in Cairo cannot be undone, but it can be buried. The mirror knows. It always knows. Burn this, and never look behind the left scrollwork until you are prepared to lose everything. Your loving brother, Roderick." A long silence followed, broken only by the rain. Lavinia's voice was barely a thread. "Roderick wrote that after the war. There was a scandal. Something about looting tombs, smuggling artifacts. Uncle Alistair covered it up, paid enormous sums. Roderick vanished eastward. We thought him dead." Poirot folded the letter again. "Yet 3 weeks ago a letter arrived from Cairo, and your uncle began to behave étrangement. He uncovered the mirror. He came here night after night, n'est-ce pas?" Denham spoke for the first time, hoarse. "I heard him, sir. Pacing, talking to someone. I thought he was going mad." "Or conversing with a ghost," Poirot said softly. "Or with a living man who knew exactly which old guilt to prod." He turned suddenly to Dr. Harrington. "Doctor, the empty file in the compartment, you recognized it, I think?" Harrington had gone very white. "Laudanum, standard brown glass, corkstopper. I'm missing one from my bag. And veronal dissolves colourless in whisky, does it not? Enough to render a man suggestible, slow to react." Harrington opened his mouth, closed it again. Poirot smiled without warmth. "We will speak privately later, Doctor." Thunder rolled again, closer. The bulb flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the attic. Someone screamed, brief, quickly stifled. Footsteps scuffled. A heavy object clattered to the floor. Poirot's voice cut through the blackness like a whip. "Stay perfectly still! Sergeant Lees, the lamp!" matches rasped. The storm lantern flared to life in Lees's hand. In its jumping glow, they saw chaos. Lady Diana's chair overturned at the foot of the stairs. Lavinia clutching her throat, Denham crouched in a boxer's stance. And on the floor, glinting evilly, a long, straight surgical scalpel, its blade wet with fresh blood. Dr. Harrington stared at his own right hand as though it belonged to a stranger. A thin line of red crossed his palm, where the scalpel had sliced as it fell. I felt someone push past me," he stammered. "A hand grabbed my wrist. I thought it was a tack." Poirot retrieved the scalpel with his handkerchief, wrapping it carefully. "No one is badly hurt," he announced, "but the murderer has made a second attempt tonight, this time in frantic haste. That is instructive." He looked around the circle of frightened, angry faces. "From this moment, no one walks alone in this house. Doors will be locked, windows checked. Tomorrow the little grace cells will work without interruption. Tonight, we have learned one thing above all." He held up the wrapped scalpel. "The killer is terrified, and terrified people, mes amis, make mistakes." Far below, the grandfather clock began to strike midnight, each note falling into the stormy night like a coffin nail. In the attic, the mirror watched them all, patient and hungry, waiting for the next reflection to break. Chapter 5. The enigmatic heiress Morning arrived pale and exhausted, as though the night itself had bled out with the storm. A watery sun struggled through the library windows, revealing dust motes that drifted like slow ghosts above the Turkey carpet. Hercule Poirot sat at the late Alistair Blackwood's desk. Immaculate, in dove grey, a cup of thick chocolate cooling beside him. Before him lay an orderly chaos. The yellowed letter from Roderick, the empty laudanum phial, the wrapped scalpel, the gold cufflink, and, most intriguing of all, a small leather-bound diary, whose lock had yielded to a bent paperclip and Poirot's delicate persuasion. Across from him sat Lavinia Blackwood, hands folded in her lap, outwardly composed. Only the faint violet shadows beneath her eyes betrayed a night without sleep. Poirot closed the diary with a soft snap. "Mademoiselle, you are a young woman of secrets. That is not a criticism. Secrets are the currency of interesting people. But some secrets, when kept too long, become poison." Lavinia lifted her chin. "I have nothing to hide that concerns my uncle's murder." "Bon, then you will not object to a little voyage into the past." He tapped the diary. "This belonged to your uncle. The final entries are illuminating. On the 9th of October, he writes, she knows about Cairo. God help me, she knows. 3 days later, Elle came to my study tonight, threatened to tell Diana everything unless I sign the new will tomorrow. I have until All Hallows Eve. And on the 28th, 3 nights ago, the mirror will decide. I go to it tonight. If Roderick is truly alive, the glass will show me the way." Lavinia's composure cracked like thin ice. "That is a lie. I never threatened him." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You deny visiting his study on the 12th? "I visited, yes. To plead, not threaten. Uncle had discovered he had letters. Letters I wrote 2 years ago to a man in London. A married man." Her voice dropped. "I was foolish, desperate for affection after my parents died. The affair ended badly. Uncle found out and was disgusted. He said I was no longer fit to inherit Blackwood, that the estate would go to the trust instead. And you feared disgrace. I feared losing everything I have ever known." She looked around the library as though seeing it for the first time. The thousands of leather-bound volumes, the marble fireplace carved with ravens, the portrait of her grandfather in yeomanry uniform. This house is all that remains of my family. Without it, I am nothing. Poirot studied her for a long moment. "Tell me about the night of the murder, mademoiselle. Every detail. You passed your uncle in the gallery at 11:35. You went to your room. Then—" Lavinia hesitated. "I could not sleep. At perhaps 12:15 I heard footsteps in the corridor, soft, deliberate. I opened my door a crack. I saw Dr. Harrington coming down from the west wing stairs." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You are certain?" "Perfectly. He was fully dressed, carrying a small black bag, his medical bag. He looked agitated. He did not see me. This is the first time you mention it. I was afraid. Miles, Dr. Harrington, has been kind to me. And to Aunt Diana. I did not want to cast suspicion without cause." Poirot made a small non-committal noise and changed tack. "Come, we will walk in the gardens. Fresh air clears the mind, and I wish to see where the old ice house stands." They left the house by the side door. The gardens, once famous, had run wild. Yew hedges grown monstrous, rose beds choked with bindweed. Gravel paths crunched underfoot. Poirot walked with his hands behind his back, humming a fragment of Offenbach. Halfway along the laurel walk, he stopped beneath a dripping cedar. "You received a letter yourself last month, I think, from Tangier." Lavinia went very still. "How could you possibly—" "Your uncle noted the postmark in his diary and underlined it thrice. He believed the writer to be Roderick. Was it? No." Her voice was barely audible. "It was from a woman calling herself Madame de Roche. She claimed to be Roderick's companion. She wrote that he was dying and wished to make amends before the end. She asked for money to bring him home. And you sent it? £500, the last of my mother's jewellery money. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And this Madame de Roche? She gave an address. A pension in the souk. When I wrote again, the letter came back unknown. They had reached the old ice house, a low brick dome half sunk into the hillside, its iron door green with verdigris. Poirot examined the padlock, new, shining, quite out of place. Curious, he murmured. Someone has use for cold storage even in October. He produced a small ring of picklocks, an item he officially did not possess, and had the padlock open in 7 seconds. Inside, the air struck chill as a crypt. Frost glittered on the brick walls. In the centre stood a wooden crate the size of a coffin, lid nailed shut. A faint, sweet, sickly smell hung about it. Lavinia recoiled. What is that? Something, I suspect, that should not be here. Poirot fetched a jemmy from the gardener's shed nearby and prized the lid with surprising strength for so small a man. Inside lay blocks of river ice packed around a shape wrapped in oilskin. Poirot folded back the cloth. A man's face stared up at them, waxen, bearded, unmistakably dead. The features were ravaged by illness or dissipation, but the Blackwood bone structure was plain. High cheekbones, the distinctive broken arrow scar on the left temple Roderick had carried since childhood. Lavinia made a small animal sound of horror. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. So Cousin Roderick did come home after all, and someone kept him very cold indeed. He replaced the oilskin with care. This man has been dead perhaps 2 weeks, cause unknown, but I think we shall find opium or poison. He was brought here secretly, hidden until what, mademoiselle? Until your uncle could be confronted with a ghost from the mirror? Lavinia was shaking. I knew nothing of this, I swear. Yet someone knew. Someone with access to the ice-house key, to laudanum, to the attic. Someone who lured your uncle upstairs with the promise of a meeting. Roderick alive, Roderick repentant, Roderick ready to expose old sins. Poirot closed the crate and relocked the padlock. We return to the house. You will say nothing of this discovery, not yet. The murderer believes Roderick's body lost forever in Morocco. That illusion is precious to us. As they walked back through the dripping gardens, Poirot glanced sideways at the heiress. You loved this cousin once, I think, when you were children. Lavinia's eyes filled with sudden tears. We were everything to each other. Before the war, before Cairo. He wrote to me from France. Beautiful letters. Then nothing. Uncle said he was dead. I mourned him for years. And now you discover he returned only to be murdered a second time, here beneath your own roof. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Poirot's voice softened, almost paternal. Courage, mademoiselle. The dead demand justice, but they also demand truth. And truth is a scalpel. It cuts the innocent as well as the guilty. You must be strong. They reached the terrace. In the library window, Dr. Harrington could be seen pacing, a silhouette against the firelight. When he caught sight of them, he stopped abruptly, staring out with an expression Poirot could not quite read. The little Belgian tucked Lavinia's hand through his arm. Come, we have disturbed one hornet's nest today. This afternoon we disturb another. I wish to speak to the good doctor about the exact dosage of veronal required to render a man insensible, and about why his medical bag was seen on the attic stairs long after he claims to have taken his own dose. High above them, in the locked west wing, the antique mirror waited. Its diseased silver had reflected Roderick Blackwood alive once, perhaps in the last days of his life. Now it reflected only empty air, and the slow creep of frost across the window panes. But mirrors, Poirot reflected as he escorted the trembling heiress indoors, have long memories, and some memories refuse to stay buried. Chapter 6. Echoes of Deception. The drawing-room had become a courtroom without a judge. At 3 o'clock sharp, Poirot had ordered every soul who had spent the night under Blackwood's roof to assemble. Even the kitchen maid and the boot boy were present, huddled at the back like frightened rabbits. A coal fire roared. Outside, a raw wind flung dead leaves against the windows like tiny frantic hands. Poirot stood before the marble chimney-piece, small, immaculate, lethal. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, voice silky, "we have reached the moment when pretense becomes expensive. This morning, in the ice house, we discovered the body of Roderick Blackwood. Dead these 14 or 15 days. Tomorrow, the police surgeon will tell us precisely how he died. Tonight I tell you why." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lady Diana's knuckles went white on the arms of her chair. Dr. Harrington half rose, thought better of it, and sank back. Denham the valet stood as though carved from oak. Only Lavinia remained perfectly still, eyes fixed on Poirot, as though he were the only solid thing in a tilting world. Poirot let the silence stretch until it was unbearable. Someone in this house expected Roderick Blackwood to arrive from Morocco. Someone prepared a welcome of ice and darkness. Someone then used his corpse as bait to draw Alistair Blackwood to the attic mirror on the night of the murder. That someone is among us now. He produced a small object wrapped in tissue and laid it on the occasional table. A tarnished silver cigarette case, engraved R.B. This was found inside the oilskin with the body. The cigarettes are Turkish, Abdullah brand, almost unobtainable in England since the war. Roderick's favourite. Whoever wrapped the body knew him intimately. Dr. Harrington found his voice. "This is monstrous. You cannot accuse—" "I accuse no one yet, Doctor. I merely arrange the facts like cards upon the table. Observe." Poirot produced a second object. A single ruby earring. Large, old-fashioned, unmistakably valuable. This was discovered 20 minutes ago by Sergeant Lees, hidden inside the lining of a travelling jewel case in your bedroom, Doctor. The clasp is broken. There is a tiny smear of blood on the gold back, still fresh enough for the laboratory to type. Harrington stared at the earring as though it were a scorpion. "That jewel belonged to Lady Diana," Poirot continued conversationally. "She noticed its mate missing from her dressing table yesterday morning. She assumed carelessness. In fact, it was stolen the night before last, during the confusion after the attempt on your life in the attic." Lady Diana's voice cracked like a whip. "Miles, you?" Harrington opened and closed his mouth several times. "I swear I have never seen that earring before in my life." Poirot smiled sadly. "Then we must ask how it travelled from her ladyship's boudoir to your room, wrapped in a handkerchief initialed M.H. But let us not leap ahead." He turned to the assembled servants. "Last night, between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock, someone entered Dr. Harrington's room while he slept heavily. Too heavily, perhaps, for a man who claims only a mild dose of veronal. Someone removed his medical bag, took the scalpel we found in the attic, and returned the bag before morning. Who has a key to the doctor's room?" Mrs. Fleet raised a trembling hand. "All the upper maids do, sir, in case of illness." Poirot nodded. "And who was on duty in the West Wing corridor last night?" Elsie, the housemaid, burst into tears. "It was me, sir! But I never left the linen cupboard, I swear. I was pressing her ladyship's nightgowns till near 2. Poirot regarded her kindly. "Yet you heard nothing? No footsteps? No door opening?" Elsie shook her head violently. "Precisely," Poirot said, "because the thief did not come from the servants' stair. They came from inside the guest wing, someone who could move silently, who knew exactly which floorboard creaked." He let that settle, then clapped his hands once. "Now we play a little game. Sergeant Lees will lock the doors. No one leaves until I say. Dr. Harrington, you will be so good as to roll up your right sleeve." Harrington went the colour of tallow. "This is outrageous, or I call the constable outside and have you arrested for theft and attempted murder. Your choice, mon ami." Slowly, as though his arm belonged to someone else, Harrington pushed back his cuff. Around the wrist was a ring of dark bruises, 4 fingers and a thumb. "Made by a woman's hand," Poirot said softly. "Small but strong. The nails left crescent marks. You struggled with your attacker in the dark attic last night, Doctor, when the lights went out. That is how the scalpel cut your palm. But the bruises are 24 hours older. They were made the night before, the night Alistair died." Lavinia made a small, wounded sound. Poirot turned to her with infinite regret. "Mademoiselle, I am desolated, but the cards speak. You visited Dr. Harrington's room after midnight on the night of the murder. You drugged his whiskey, enough veronal to keep him senseless for hours. You took his scalpel. You waited in the attic for your uncle. When he arrived, you released the tripwire, slashed his throat as he fell forward, wrote your accusation in blood, pressed his dying finger to the frame to create the print, explaining why it was unsmudged, and left the cufflink you had stolen earlier from his dressing room. A perfect frame for the doctor, who had motive, debts, and opportunity." Lavinia rose slowly. All colour had drained from her face, but her voice was steady. "You are very clever, Monsieur Poirot. Too clever. Yes, I hated my uncle for what he threatened to do to me. Yes, I learned from Roderick's woman in Tangier that he was coming home to expose the Cairo scandal, the one that would ruin us all. When Roderick died, opium, the doctor said later, I saw my chance. I kept the body cold, forged letters in Roderick's hand to terrify Uncle into the attic night after night. On All Hallows' Eve, I sent the final note, "Meet me at the mirror, or the world learns everything." He came. I killed him. The rest you know. Lady Diana gave a thin, animal scream and fainted clean away. Dr. Harrington stared at Lavinia as though seeing her for the first time. Poirot's eyes were grave. "You confess, then?" Lavinia laughed, a small, brittle sound. "Confess? No, monsieur, I accuse." She reached into her cardigan pocket and drew out a dainty pearl-handled revolver. "Stand very still, all of you." Sergeant Lees reached for his whistle. Poirot lifted one finger. Wait. Lavinia backed toward the French windows. "I killed no one," she said clearly, "but someone wishes you to believe I did. That earring, planted this morning while I walked with Monsieur Poirot. Those bruises on the doctor's wrist. I wonder who has fingernails sharp enough, and reason to silence him before he spoke too much." She smiled at Poirot, a strange, almost pitying smile. "You have been brilliantly wrong, little man. The murderer is still in this room, and they are terrified I will name them. That is why they framed me so clumsily. Watch." Before anyone could move, she turned the revolver, not on the others, but on the tall gilt pier glass that hung opposite the fireplace. She fired once. The mirror exploded into 1,000 silver shards. In the fractured second before screams filled the room, Poirot saw it. Behind the shattered glass, a narrow spy hole pierced the wall, and for an instant no more, a pale, terrified eye staring back. Then the eye vanished. Lavinia dropped the smoking revolver and laughed again, this time with pure relief. "There," she said. "Now perhaps you will look for the real murderer in the walls, Monsieur Poirot, instead of in the hearts of broken women." Chaos erupted. Servants shrieked. Denham lunged for the fallen gun. Harrington knelt beside the unconscious Lady Diana. Poirot alone remained perfectly still, staring at the ruined mirror and the dark little hole that had watched everything. His eyes narrowed to green slits. "Tiens," he murmured, "so the house itself has eyes. And the mirror? The mirror was never the only one watching." Far away, in some hidden passage behind the wainscot, frantic footsteps receded like a dying heartbeat. The game, Poirot reflected grimly, had entered its most dangerous phase. Chapter 7. The Mirror's Secret. The house changed the instant the pier glass exploded. Until that moment, Blackwood Manor had merely been old, sad, and murderous. Now it revealed itself as something older still. A warren, a puzzle box, a living thing with arteries behind the plaster and lungs in the chimneys. The shot had torn away the last pretence of civility. Poirot stood amid glittering shards, coat speckled with silver dust, eyes blazing. "Sergeant Lees! Constable Briggs! The panelling behind the mirror! Quickly, quickly!" The two policemen threw their weight against the oak wainscot. It resisted, then swung inward, with a groan of long-unused hinges. A narrow passage yawned, black as a coal mine, exhaling cold air that smelled of mouse droppings and candle smoke. Poirot seized a lamp and stepped inside without hesitation. The passage was barely wider than his shoulders. The floorboards creaked beneath wallpaper pasted directly onto lath. 10 paces in, the tunnel forked. To the left, a spiral of stone stairs descended toward the cellars. To the right, a straight run parallel to the drawing-room wall, ending at a second spy hole covered by a sliding wooden shutter. Poirot opened it. Through the hole, he looked directly onto the spot where Lavinia had stood moments before. Someone sitting here could have heard every word, seen every gesture, even reached through to plant the ruby earring while the household slept. Footprints in the thick dust, small, narrow, the heel of a woman's indoor shoe, led only one way, downward. Poirot followed. The stone stairs were medieval, worn into scoops by centuries of secret feet. They ended in a low-vaulted chamber directly beneath the west wing. A single candle guttered in a niche, throwing light on a scene that stopped even Poirot's breath. A camp bed, a spirit stove, a pile of blankets. On a crate lay a man's shaving kit, a half-eaten tin of bully beef, and most damning of all, a neat stack of forged letters written in a spidery imitation of Roderick Blackwood's hand. Beside them, a woman's black kid glove, the fingertips stained rust brown. Poirot lifted the glove delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Blood," he murmured. "Our murderer has been living inside the walls like a rat, watching, waiting, striking." A soft scrape of leather on stone behind him. He whirled, too late. The candle snuffed out, as though pinched by invisible fingers. Darkness swallowed him whole, and something heavy crashed against the back of his skull. He fell forward into velvet blackness. The last thing he felt the cold kiss of ancient stone against his cheek. He awoke to the sound of dripping water and the smell of brandy. Lavinia's face swam above him, pale and fierce. She held a lantern in one hand and his own flask in the other. "Drink," she ordered. "You've been unconscious nearly 20 minutes." Poirot obeyed, wincing as fire ran down his throat. The back of his head throbbed like a drum. "You followed me," he croaked. "I saw you go in. When you didn't return, I fetched the police revolver and came after." Whoever struck you fled up the second stair. There's another passage behind the library chimney. They're still in the house." Poirot struggled to his feet, swaying. "The glove! Did you see it? Gone. Everything gone. The bed stripped. The letters burned in the stove. Only ash left." She hesitated. There was one thing they missed. She held out a small tortoise-shell comb. 2 teeth broken, a single long iron-grey hair caught in it. "Lady Diana's," she said quietly. Poirot stared at the comb until the lantern light blurred. "Impossible," he whispered. "She has not left her bath chair in 5 years. Hasn't she?" Together they climbed the secret stair behind the library chimney. It emerged through a false panel in the panelling directly beside Lady Diana's bedroom door. The door itself stood ajar. Inside, the room was in chaos. Drawers pulled out, papers strewn, the medicine cabinet smashed. On the floor lay the bath chair, tipped on its side like a dead beetle. Lady Diana was gone. Dr. Harrington met them in the corridor, face ashen. "She insisted on being moved to the East Wing after the shooting," he stammered, "said she felt unsafe. 2 constables carried her, chair and all, not an hour ago. I gave her a sedative. My God, if she has been feigning paralysis." Poirot's mind raced like an engine. "The paralysis began after a hunting accident in 22, he said rapidly. "A fall from horseback. You treated her, doctor?" Harrington nodded. "And the rheumatism? The laudanum dependence?" "Real enough at first, but the dosages, I reduced them gradually. She insisted on higher and higher." Poirot cut him off. "She has played us all for fools. The devoted invalid, the helpless dowager, watching through the walls while her brother destroyed himself with guilt. She knew about Cairo. Perhaps she was part of it. When Roderick threatened to return, she silenced him with opium, hid the body, forged the letters, lured Alistair to the mirror, and killed him with the strength she had hoarded for 5 years." He turned to Lavinia. "The word on the mirror, murderer, written with the left hand," the doctor said. "Lady Diana is left-handed. Everyone forgot, because for years she has only used her right to hold a teacup or a lace handkerchief." They ran. The East Wing was silent, unnaturally so. The constable on duty outside Lady Diana's new room lay slumped against the wall, head bleeding from a blow of the brass-headed cane that now lay discarded beside him. The room was empty. The window stood open to the night. Cold air bellied the curtains. On the sill, a single drop of fresh blood glistened. Someone had cut themselves on the jagged latch in their haste. Poirot leaned out. Below, the old magnolia tree spread its gnarled arms almost to the casement. Broken twigs and dislodged leaves showed where a desperate woman had climbed down. "She cannot have gone far," Harrington said. In her condition, Poirot interrupted grimly. "She has just murdered 2 men and lived inside walls like a spider for weeks. Underestimate her no longer." He snatched up the speaking tube that connected to the stables and whistled into it. "Inspector Moss, all men to the grounds. Lady Diana Blackwood has escaped, armed and highly dangerous. Search the ice house, the old chapel, the river path. She will try to reach the moor." He turned back to the room. On the dressing table lay a final taunt. The mate to the ruby earring, placed neatly beside an open pot of stage grease paint, flesh tone used to whiten an invalid's cheeks, and a half-empty bottle of belladonna drops. Poirot picked up the earring. In the lamplight, the stone looked exactly like a drop of frozen blood. "She leaves us her jewels," he said softly, "as though the game were over. But it is not over. Non, 1000 fois non. The mirror has shown us the last reflection, And now Hercule Poirot will have his reckoning. Far away across the dark gardens, a woman's laugh, high, mad, exultant, floated back on the wind, mocking them all. The hunt had become a chase, and the prey was no longer helpless. Chapter 8. Betrayals unveiled. The moor swallowed sound the way a grave swallows a coffin lid. By the time the stable yard rang with shouts and the great police lanterns were lit, Lady Diana Blackwood had a 20-minute start. 20 minutes on a moonless night, with fog rolling in from the river like wet wool, was a lifetime. Poirot stood on the terrace wrapped in a borrowed ulster, eyes narrowed against the wind. Inspector Moss was already organising search parties. Dogs from the home farm, constables with hurricane lamps, grooms on horseback. Yet Poirot felt the futility of it. The moor was 9,000 acres of heather bog and standing stones. A woman who had hidden inside walls for weeks would not stumble blindly into lantern light. "She is not running away," he said quietly to Moss. "She is running to something, a place she has prepared." Moss grunted. "The old tin mine? The ruined chapel? Both too obvious. No. She needs transport, money, papers. Somewhere close enough to reach on foot, hidden enough to wait until dawn." Poirot's gaze swept the black bulk of the gardens, the glass houses, the stable block, the river path. Then his eyes fixed on the one building no one ever entered any more. The old coach house, shuttered since 1918 when the last rolls had been sold to pay Roderick's gambling debts. He snapped his fingers. "The coach house! Vite!" They ran. The great double doors were padlocked, but the hasp had been freshly filed. The lock hung open like a broken jaw. Inside smelled of axle grease, mouse nests and petrol. A single hurricane lamp burned low on a workbench. Lady Diana stood beside a dusty 1922 Sunbeam touring car, its bonnet raised. She wore a man's tweed coat 3 sizes too large, Alistair's, stolen weeks ago, and a felt hat pulled low. In her left hand she held a heavy Webley service revolver. In her right, a leather document case. She looked up as Poirot stepped into the circle of light, and for the first time he saw her standing fully upright. Tall, gaunt, terrifyingly alive. "So," she said, voice husky from years of feigned weakness, "the little Belgian finally understands." "Comprends tout," Poirot replied, calm as Sunday. "The paralysis, the laudanum, the saintly invalid, all a performance worthy of Sarah Bernhardt. You fooled doctors, family, servants. For 5 years you crept through the walls you yourself had mapped as a child, listening, planning, waiting for the moment to strike." Lady Diana smiled. It was not pleasant. Alistair and Roderick thought Cairo was their secret. They stole a Coptic burial mirror, the very one upstairs, and with it a scarab of Queen Ty. Priceless. They sold the scarab in 1919, split the money, and swore silence. But Roderick spent his share on opium and whores, then threatened to talk when the money ran out. Alistair paid and paid until he could pay no more. When Roderick wrote that he was coming home to confess everything, Alistair panicked. He planned to kill him. She laughed softly. "I merely helped fate along. I met Roderick at Exeter Station, brought him secretly to the house, kept him quiet with my own laudanum. When he became troublesome, I gave him rather more. Then I stored him in the ice house and forged his letters. Every night I whispered through the speaking tubes, pretending to be his guilty conscience." Alistair began to crack. The mirror became his confessional. "On All Hallows' Eve, I sent the final note in Roderick's hand. 'Meet me tonight, or I tell the world.' He came. I was waiting. She lifted the revolver a fraction. The tripwire was my own invention. The scalpel, borrowed from poor, stupid Miles, was perfect. The word in blood, a flourish. I had always hated that mirror. It watched me when I was a child. I wanted it to watch him die. Poirot took one careful step forward. And the cufflink, the planted earring, the attempt on Harrington in the attic? Distractions. I needed suspicion scattered like chaff. Lavinia was too obvious. I had to muddy the waters. Miles was convenient. He has been stealing morphine for his own use for months. I knew he would never dare speak up. From the darkness behind her came the low growl of a dog. One of the constables' hounds had picked up the scent. Lanterns flickered at the coach-house doors. Lady Diana's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Poirot. "I should have killed you in the passage," she said almost regretfully. "A mistake." "Many murderers make it," Poirot replied. "They underestimate the little grey cells. But tell me one thing before the end, madame. Why the mirror? Why not poison, a shooting, something simple?" For the first time, something almost human crossed her face. "Because I wanted him to see himself as he truly was. A thief, a coward, a murderer of his own brother. The mirror never lies, monsieur. That is why I hated it, and why I needed it." She raised the revolver. Poirot did not flinch. Outside, Moss's voice rang out. "Armed police! Drop the weapon!" Lady Diana's smile widened. "Goodbye, little man." She put the barrel to her temple and pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Poirot allowed himself the smallest of sighs. "Forgive me, madame. When you were busy with the car, I took the liberty of removing the cartridges. One should never trust a revolver left loaded in a coach-house for 7 years." For a moment, she simply stared, the useless gun dangling. Then the fight went out of her like air from a punctured balloon. The Webley clattered to the concrete. She sank to her knees amid the oil stains. Suddenly, an old woman again, grey, broken, finished. Constables swarmed in. Moss snapped handcuffs on wrists that no longer resisted. As they led her away, Lady Diana looked back once at Poirot. "The mirror wins," she whispered. "It always wins." Poirot watched the doors close behind her, then turned to the dusty sunbeam. In the document case lay a forged passport, £500 in notes, and a first-class ticket on the RMS Aquitania, sailing from Southampton at noon tomorrow. He closed the case with a soft click. "Non, madame," he said to the empty coach-house. "This time, Hercule Poirot wins." Outside, the fog began to lift. Somewhere in the distance, a cock crowed, absurdly premature, as though the night itself had been a bad dream the Moor was already forgetting. But in the attic, the great Venetian mirror stood waiting, patient as ever. Its diseased silver, ready for the next soul, foolish enough to seek its truth. Chapter 9. The Final Gathering. The drawing-room smelled of beeswax, wet wool, and finality. At 10:30 on a cold, bright morning, Hercule Poirot had ordered every surviving player in the tragedy to assemble one last time. The shattered pier glass had been removed. Its empty gilt frame gaped like a missing tooth. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, mercilessly revealing every line of exhaustion on every face. Lady Diana Blackwood was not present. She sat in a locked bedroom under police guard, and the care of a sedative so strong that she had not spoken since the coach-house. Dr. Harrington stood at the fireplace, hollow-eyed, a bandage around his bruised wrist. Lavinia sat very straight on a gilt chair, hands folded, the pearl-handled revolver, now harmless, resting on the table before her like an exhibit. Denham the valet hovered behind her, rigid with protective fury. Mrs. Fleet wept quietly into a handkerchief. Inspector Moss and 2 sergeants stood by the door, notebooks ready. Poirot entered last, immaculate in charcoal grey, the white camellia in his buttonhole the only touch of colour. He carried nothing but his Malacca cane and the small leather dispatch case that never left his sight. He placed the case on the table, opened it, and arranged its contents with deliberate care. The forged letters, the tortoiseshell comb, the empty Webley, the ruby earrings reunited in a velvet box, the gold cufflink, the phial of laudanum, and finally, wrapped in silk, the yellowed letter from Roderick, dated 1919. He surveyed the room. Mesdames et messieurs, we have reached the moment of truth. Not the partial truth of confessions extracted at gunpoint, nor the convenient truth of a suicide that never happened. The complete truth, and truth, like good champagne, must be uncorked carefully. He turned first to Lavinia. Mademoiselle, you have been cruelly used. You believed yourself the murderer's chosen scapegoat, and you fired at the mirror to prove the house itself spied upon us. A brave act, a reckless act, but it gave me the last piece. He lifted the 2 ruby earrings. These, for example. Lady Diana stole only one, the left. The right earring was taken earlier by another hand entirely and hidden in Dr. Harrington's room to cast suspicion on him. That hand belonged to the person who truly wrote the word murderer on the glass. A ripple of unease. Poirot's gaze moved to Denham. Monsieur le valet, you have served this family for 15 years with absolute loyalty. Yet loyalty can be a blindfold. You knew the secret passages better than anyone. You played in them as a boy when your father was butler here. You oiled the hinges, you kept the keys, you listened at night to your master's nightmares. And when Roderick Blackwood returned, half mad with opium and threatening to destroy everything you had sworn to protect, you acted. Denham did not move, but something shifted behind his eyes. Poirot lifted the tortoiseshell comb. This is Lady Diana's, yes, but the hair caught in it is not hers. It is shorter, darker at the root, greying at the tip, a man's hair. Yours, I think. He produced a second comb from his pocket, Denham's own, taken from his dressing-room that morning, and held them side by side. The hairs matched perfectly. On the night Alistair died, Poirot continued softly, you waited in the passage behind the library chimney. You heard everything, the forged letters, the threats, the appointment at the mirror. You followed your master upstairs. You released the tripwire, your own invention, copied from a Boer War campaign you fought in. You cut his throat with Dr. Harrington's scalpel, stolen earlier, while the doctor lay drugged by his own veronal, administered by you in his nightly whiskey. You wrote the accusation in blood with your left hand. You are ambidextrous. I watched you polish the silver left-handed only yesterday. Then you pressed your master's dying finger to the frame, the perfect unsmudged print, and dropped the cufflink you had taken from his drawer weeks before. Denham's face had gone the colour of old parchment. You hid Roderick's body in the ice house. You had the strength to carry it alone. You forged the final notes in Roderick's hand. You had practiced his signature for years, copying it for checks when he was abroad. You even planted the ruby earring in Harrington's room to muddy the waters further. And when Lady Diana began to suspect, because she too used the passages, you struck her a glancing blow in the cellar passage, took her comb to implicate her, and left her unconscious, knowing the household would believe the paralyzed woman could never have done it. He paused. But you made one mistake, mon ami. You are a sentimental man. You could not bear to see Miss Lavinia condemned. When she confessed, in this very room yesterday, you crept through the passage behind the pier glass, ready to silence anyone who threatened her. That is why the eye we glimpsed was not a woman's, It was yours. And why, when Lady Diana was arrested last night, you crept to her room and left the second ruby earring on her table, your last attempt to shift the blame entirely onto her. Silence, absolute and suffocating. Denham looked slowly around the room, at Lavinia's white face, at Harrington's horror, at Mrs. Fleet's open-mouthed shock, and something inside him broke. He reached into his waistcoat and drew out a small service revolver, an old Webley, twin to the one Lady Diana had used. Lavinia cried out. Poirot did not move. "Put it down, Denham," Inspector Moss barked, stepping forward. Denham shook his head almost gently. "I loved this house," he said, voice cracked with 15 years of swallowed pride. "I loved her." His eyes flicked to Lavinia, raw and naked. Master Alistair was going to throw it all away, the name, the land, the girl, to the National Trust, to strangers. And Roderick would have dragged us all into the gutter with his filthy secrets. I killed to protect what was mine to protect. He raised the revolver, not toward the police, but toward his own temple. Lavinia screamed, "Reginald, no!" Poirot's voice cut across the room like a blade. "No! You will not escape by the coward's path. You will stand trial, and you will watch Miss Lavinia walk free, knowing you did it all for nothing. That is your real punishment." For a long moment, Denham wavered. Then the fight went out of him. The revolver clattered to the parquet. He sank to his knees, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Moss and the sergeants moved in swiftly. Handcuffs clicked. As they led him away, Denham looked back once at Lavinia. "I'm sorry, miss," he whispered. "I only wanted to keep you safe." Lavinia could not answer. She sat frozen, tears sliding down her cheeks, as the man who had loved her enough to kill for her was taken from the room forever. Poirot closed his dispatch case with a soft snap. "And that, mes amis," he said quietly, "is the whole truth. The mirror reflected many things. Guilt, greed, madness. But in the end, it reflected only one murderer. A man who believed love could justify anything." He bowed slightly to the stunned company. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a train to catch. London calls, and the little grey cells require chocolate." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One last thing. The Venetian mirror. It will be crated and sent to the British Museum. Let scholars argue over its curse. For myself, I prefer mirrors that show only what is truly there." He tipped his hat and was gone. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the fog. Blackwood Manor stood silent, its secrets dragged into the light at last. And high in the empty attic, the great mirror waited, patient, blind, and finally, mercifully, powerless. Chapter 10. Reflections resolved. 3 weeks later, on a bright December afternoon, Hercule Poirot stood alone in the West Wing attic of Blackwood Manor. House was empty now. Lavinia had gone to London with a distant cousin, carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and the deed to a much diminished estate. Dr. Harrington had resigned his practice and vanished, rumour said to Canada. Lady Diana, silent and broken, had been moved to a private sanatorium near Torquay, where the doctors spoke gently of nervous collapse and kept the keys on the outside of the door. Denham awaited trial at Exeter Assizes. The newspapers called it the Mirror Murder, and printed his photograph beside lurid drawings of the blood-scrawled glass. The Venetian mirror itself was gone, carefully crated, and already on its way to Bloomsbury, under the guardianship of a nervous young curator who had begged Poirot for a charm against curses. In its place stood only a pale rectangle on the wallpaper, and a few curled flakes of ancient silver on the floorboards. Poirot walked slowly around the empty space, hands clasped behind his back, humming a little tune under his breath. He had come back for one last look, ostensibly to collect a misplaced glove, but in truth because certain cases leave a residue on the soul. And this had been one of the darkest. He needed to see the room naked of its monster to reassure himself that evil, once named, loses its power to terrify. Yet the attic was not entirely empty. Lavinia Blackwood stood in the doorway, thinner than he remembered, wrapped in a camel hair coat, a black velvet beret tilted over one eye. She carried a small bunch of winter jasmine, yellow stars against the gloom. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly. Poirot bowed. "Mademoiselle, you should not be in this house. It holds nothing for you now but sorrow." "Perhaps." She stepped inside, laid the jasmine on the windowsill, where the light caught the petals like tiny flames. "But I needed to say goodbye properly. To the house, to the mirror, to everything." She turned to him, eyes steady. "I came to thank you, Monsieur Poirot. You gave me back my life, even if it is a smaller life than I once imagined." Poirot waved a modest hand. "I gave you only the truth. Sometimes truth is a harsh gift, but it is the only one worth having." Lavinia moved to the place where the mirror had stood. She touched the wall, almost caressingly. "Do you know what Denham said to me the night before they took him away? He asked me to forgive him. He said he had loved me since I was 14 years old, in silence, always in silence, and that when Uncle threatened to disinherit me, he felt the world ending. He thought if Uncle and Roderick were gone, the house would be safe, and I would be safe in it forever." Her voice trembled, but only slightly. "I cannot forgive him," she said, "but I understand him. That is almost worse." Poirot nodded. Love that believes it owns the beloved is a dangerous thing. It becomes possession, then punishment, then murder. Denham looked into the mirror and saw not his own reflection, but the image of what he wished to protect. The glass merely held the picture up to him. Lavinia was silent a moment. Outside, rooks wheeled over the bare trees, their cries thin and mournful. "I am selling the estate," she said at last. "Most of it to the National Trust, ironically enough. A small fund will be set aside for Aunt Diana's care. The rest, well, there is enough to begin again somewhere the name Blackwood means nothing. Perhaps in Italy. I have always wanted to see Venice." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "A city of reflections, mademoiselle. Be careful which ones you trust." She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. "I shall buy only the smallest, clearest mirrors from now on." They walked together down the attic stairs for the last time. The house echoed around them, already half museum, half ruin. In the great hall the grandfather clock still ticked, but the suit of armour had been sold, the portraits taken down. Sunlight slanted through bare windows onto naked floors. At the front door, Lavinia paused. "Will you keep the little grey cells exercised on happier puzzles now, monsieur?" "Alas, crime is never happy. But justice can be a kind of happiness." He lifted her hand and kissed it with formal gallantry. "Go with God, mademoiselle, and remember, the past is a mirror we cannot break, but we can choose which room to hang it in." She laughed softly, a sound like breaking ice in spring. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." The Bentley was waiting. As it purred down the drive, Poirot looked back once. Lavinia stood on the steps, small and solitary, against the great facade, the winter jasmine bright in her hand. For an instant, she seemed no more than a child waving farewell to a house that had tried to devour her. Then the car turned the corner, and Blackwood Manor was gone. In the attic, the bunch of jasmine slowly dropped its petals, one by one, onto the exact spot where a murderer had once written an accusation in blood. By nightfall, the flowers were withered, the scent faded, and the room was only a room. Dusty, cold, and finally, mercifully, at peace. Far away in London, Hercule Poirot poured himself a small glass of crème de menthe and raised it to the crackling fire. "To reflections," he murmured, "that show us clearly enough to walk away." Outside, the city lights shimmered on the Thames like 1,000 harmless mirrors, and the night, for once, held no secrets at all.